Tonight on Primetime Politics, ejected.
I will take a break while you're asked to leave.
A lawyer for protest organizers is removed from the commission room as Justice Paul Rouleau hears testimony from the Ministers of Public Safety and Intergovernmental Affairs. We'll show you what happened. Also,
Belarus is complicit in Russia's invasion of Ukraine,
sanctioning the Lukashenko regime. Ottawa announces new measures as the Belarusian opposition leader meets with Canadian leaders. We will speak to Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. And
frankly, I'm baffled by Premier Houston's position.
Imposing a consumer carbon tax after Nova Scotia refuses. Federal ministers don't hide their frustration, and coming up, we'll get some reaction from Nova Scotia's Environment Minister. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. We begin with the Public Order Emergency Commission, and on a day when both the Public Safety Minister and the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister were scheduled to testify, unexpectedly it turned out to be a testy moment that dominated this 28th day of public hearings, a moment between a protest lawyer and the inquiry's commissioner. Take a listen.
The Government of Canada has redacted without lawful authority all of these statements from these staffers and have suppressed records.
I have no idea at this point where this is going, so I'm going to take the break. And if you can speak to Commission Counsel, which I think I've repeated many times, is the way to at least raise the issue.
Yes.
And then we'll see if they can resolve it or not. But we have a schedule. And
sir, the schedule is not as important at getting to the truth.
There's no question we want to get at the truth, but you know what? It's a very complex issue, and it's not all about what you want. The application, if you want to do it, you've been advised it's to be done in writing, not in the middle of the presentation.
Sir, we filed 2 motions in writing at your direction that you've refused to rule on with respect to the redaction of documents from the Government of Canada.
You're speaking,
that has not been ruled on, and they've been filed for days.
I will take a break while you're asked to leave. I will return in 5 minutes if security could deal with the council.
Well, with more, we're now joined by Tonda MacCharles, parliamentary reporter for the Toronto Star, who's covering the inquiry, and Joanna Smith, the Ottawa bureau chief for the Canadian Press. Hello to the two of you.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Michael.
Hi there. So I do want to begin with what took place, the ejection from the room, because that exchange that we heard, it really seems to go to 2 issues here. One has to do with the Public Safety Minister's Director of Communications, the other about documents the government is releasing to the inquiry and portions of those documents that are redacted. Now, Brendan Miller is the lawyer who was ejected. He says both are needed to get a full picture of what happened. How true is that statement, Tonda?
Well, I mean, the judge ruled not much longer after that whole scene broke out in the inquiry room that, in fact, the documents were rightfully redacted, that the evidence which he got to see, unredacted, was either not relevant or was protected by cabinet privilege. So he did basically rule against what the convoy lawyer was saying, that it was so relevant that it had to be brought in immediately and that he had to be able to call one of the minister's staffers who was in the room. Look, it was much ado about much less than meets the eye, really, because fundamentally, the lawyer for the convoy is putting forward a theory that, the whole attempt he's putting forward a theory that there's a political attempt by staffers in the government to paint the convoy protesters as extremists from the get-go, from before the convoy arrived, in order to be able to invoke emergency powers against them. And so he's pulling together all kinds of strings out of thin air somewhat, and in the process, is really, I think, casting a bad light on actually what the convoy organizers themselves are trying to argue here, which is that the act itself and the government's use of it was an overreach. It's off on a tangent, if you will. It's quite difficult to follow, and it's resulted in a libel notice being issued today against the lawyer for espousing those views.
Now, not only did Justice Rouleau issue his own judgment on those redacted portions of documents, Mr. Miller was allowed back into the inquiry room. And, you know, Joanna, given what we just heard from Tonda, I'm wondering from what you saw, did his line of questioning reveal any new pertinent detail or information?
Not really. You know, as Tonda said, this lawyer seems to be really focused on this idea that not only the government was trying to paint everyone as extremists from the get-go, but was engaging in some sort of subterfuge, really playing up the idea, like taking advantage of the fact these protests were really divisive, and sort of, you know, he's putting forward this unsubstantiated theory he has that the government might have actually gone so far as to plant some operatives like agents provocateurs who were responsible for the presence of hateful imagery such as swastikas and Confederate flags in the crowd as a way to influence public opinion. And like Tonda said, a lot of this is really seems to be strings coming from all over the air. So I think, you know, he keeps pushing this point, and it's really raising the ire of the commissioner, and that's sort of the tenure of those exchanges today.
Okay, so that it took a lot of oxygen out of the room today. But let's switch over to the testimony that we did hear, beginning with Marco Mendicino, the public safety minister. Now, he talked about the RCMP, CSIS assessments, but also, I guess, shared some of his reasoning for invoking the act. Take a listen right now to Marco Mendicino.
My concern, in my capacity as the Minister for Public Safety, is that if we don't equip police with the additional tools and the authorities that they need to specifically address the gaps that they had been consistently briefing us on, then that might lead to more violence. And so we also had to weigh the risks of not taking the decision to invoke. And so that we weighed in the potential concerns around radicalization, but ultimately we came down on the side of invoking.
Now, the public safety minister's conversation, his testimony today took up a lot of time. I'm wondering, Tonda, from listening to Marco Mendicino, do you have better insight now into his justification for invoking the act?
Well, to this extent, I mean, we've heard now, actually the third minister is on the stand and he just completed his examination in chief. So, look, we've heard from three different ministers what was, I guess, the salient point for them. Minister Blair yesterday talked about the border blockades and the economic damage being what tipped it over into a national emergency for him. In Marco Mendicino's mind today, what tipped it over for him, it seems, was a conversation he had with the RCMP commissioner around the weapons in Coutts. And this was at a critical moment just before a cabinet meeting on Sunday, February 13th, where they were going to weigh invoking the Emergencies Act. And he says he doesn't recall seeing her email that expressed her reservations about the Emergencies Act, but he does very clearly recall her alarm at what the RCMP believed was present at the Coutts blockade in a trailer there. They had undercover RCMP officers who, she said, lives were on the line if word were to leak out about a pending raid on the blockade in Coutts that ultimately produced a cache of weapons and charges against 13 individuals. So look, for Mendicino, he says that was the tipping point for him. But he very much made the point, it wasn't about just that, or it wasn't just about the Ottawa convoy, which he called had resulted in utter mayhem, I think is the word he used for Ottawa. He said, let's call a spade a spade. It was chaos. Well, he says it wasn't just about Ottawa or just about Coutts. He said it was, in his words, the totality of what was going on across the country, and that they really didn't think that police were effectively using, even if they had existing tools, were effectively using them.
Okay, not effectively using them, according to the minister. But, you know, we did hear from the RCMP. We've heard from the Ottawa Police. We heard from the Ontario Provincial Police. And each one, when they testified, they stated they did not ask for the act to be invoked. So talk to us, Joanna, about how the minister responded to that.
I think it was the sense that that wasn't the impression he was given, right? We had heard about this email that Brenda Lucki, the RCMP commissioner, had sent to Mendicino's staff about this idea that not all tools have been exhausted. And he said, that never made it to me. As Tonda said, that conversation he had with Lucki, he really came away with the impression that she supported the invocation of the Emergencies Act. He went so far as to say, this was a threshold moment for me. So that was sort of your sort of understanding that maybe this was a huge issue of miscommunication, which was frankly a problem throughout the whole protest to begin with. But you're sort of coming away, I think, with the impression that everyone was viewing things through a slightly different light. Everyone was maybe coming into things with preconceived notions. Everyone was making a lot of assumptions about what everyone else was thinking and how and why they were going to act. So I feel like that's a common thread that we saw reinforced today with Mendicino. And there was another interesting moment when he was sort of asked, if you had to sort of pick protests and responses to protests, is that sort of an appropriate thing to do? And he in terms of, responding to the border versus responding to Ottawa. And he says, it's not the kind of choice or dilemma you want to be in on where you want to focus your energies. And he was really sort of talking about this in the context of this question of potential political interference in police operations. So he said, elected government should steer clear of that. That's a slippery slope. So if we're talking about a situation, that's where his thinking is, and if the RCMP is, according to him, telling him that this is what we need, then you can kind of start to see how these decisions ended up being made.
Mm-hmm. Quickly running out of time, so I'm going to ask for very.
Well, I was just.
Go ahead.
I just want to quickly say that, notwithstanding whatever reservations Lucki conveyed to the minister or didn't convey, in her letter is a whole list of bullet points of useful tools that the RCMP thought the Emergencies Act could give them and how they would be used. So it wasn't as if she was just saying, don't do it.
Okay. Now, you referenced the third minister, and right now Dominic LeBlanc, the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, is on the stand at the time of this taping, not yet complete. So very quickly from both of you, if you will, what are you keeping an ear out for right now? Tonda, I'll begin with you.
Well, look, Minister LeBlanc, I found what was most interesting so far about all of his testimony is this glimpse behind the scenes of what was going on in the private conversations, minister to minister and premiers to ministers. And what LeBlanc revealed was just these scathing series of texts that he got from the Alberta premier, saying that, that Ottawa's basically leaving him hanging out to dry, that they brought in these vaccine mandates that he called dumb political theater, and he just ripped Minister LeBlanc, who conveyed that to two of his cabinet colleagues in a text. And then we saw also other tensions between the Ontario government and Marco Mendicino when he was pressing the Ontario government for what more they could do and what plan they could bring up. It looks like the Ontario the Solicitor General, basically told him to take a flying leap, that she said, you're not the boss of me. I'll spare you the language she used. But look, behind the scenes, LeBlanc was at the center of that, and he got a real taste of it, and that's what he conveyed. There was big pressure on the government. Okay, very quickly, Joanna, and for you, when it comes to Mr. LeBlanc?
Just how important relationships and poor relationships could have played a role in all of this. There were, as Tonda was saying, he was relaying scathing messages from Kenny about how the feds were reacting to this. But you saw that little group chat between LeBlanc and Transport Minister Al Gabra and Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino. This sort of, I think at one point Al Gabra, where we saw texted, speaking of bonkers, when referring to Kenny. So you can sort of tell these not great relations between all those people, and maybe that also played a role in how things went down.
Well, appreciate the time and helping us walk through what we've seen today. Tonda MacCharles, Joanna Smith, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
And a reminder, we do have continuing coverage of the Public Order Emergency Commission right here for you on CPAC. You can also tune into our live stream of each day's testimony. You can find that on our website, cpac.ca. And that is also where you'll find the full proceedings, because we are archiving it for you, and it will be made available for you on demand. Well, July the 1st, 2023 will see a new tax imposed on 3 Atlantic provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador, PEI and Nova Scotia. All 3 will start paying consumer carbon taxes. Now, they join Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba and Ontario, who are already subjected to the federal regime. This after failing to create a provincial plan that met federal standards. For his part, the Nova Scotia Premier did write a letter to the federal Environment Minister ahead of today's announcement, stating Nova Scotia had its own plan and that the imposition of a carbon tax was unnecessarily punishing for Nova Scotians. Take a listen to how the Environment Minister responded to that.
The fact that Nova Scotia had a plan is a good thing, but it's simply not true that their plan was better without pricing, because they can have the plan and pricing and make their plan even better, as we're doing at the federal level. I find it unconscionable, really, that Premier Houston would have this type of attitude after what we've seen in Atlantic Canada with the passage of the most severe hurricane in the history of Canada. We've never seen anything like this.
So that was the federal minister, Steven Guilbeault. Minister Halman, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, I want to first get your reaction to what you just heard from Minister Guilbeault. He seems to be reacting to an earlier letter that your Premier wrote in which he pushes back on Ottawa's carbon pricing. Your reaction to what you just heard?
Look, Nova Scotia is a leader in Confederation on climate change policies, and we have been for quite some time. And last fall we passed the most ambitious piece of climate change legislation in the country. We have the strongest greenhouse gas emission targets in Canada, 53% below 2005 levels by 2030, 80% renewable commitment by 2030. So I'm confident in our leadership on the climate change file. I don't believe rhetoric like that is necessary, because this is a policy difference. We agree with the federal government on climate action. However, we have a different path, and we've proposed a different path. Nova Scotia does not believe a carbon tax in a time of historic global inflation is necessary to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. Rather, the best path forward for this jurisdiction in Canada is aggressively, developing green hydrogen, offshore wind, the unbelievable power and potential of the Bay of Fundy. And that's what we've been proposing to Ottawa for a number of months. Work with us on those things. I can't help but feel there's been a missed opportunity on the part of the federal government here to look at alternatives to adapt to climate change.
Okay,
but unfortunately, Ottawa hasn't done that.
Well, let's dig down a bit more on the point you're trying to make here, because I'm kind of wondering what is the scenario that you're envisioning. You're talking about alternate sources of energy as one path forward, but what about the bigger picture that Nova Scotia is proposing? Because it's not just Ottawa, but many global economists, policymakers around the world, they do argue that carbon pricing on consumer consumption is one of the best tools to combat climate change.
Well, certainly to change and alter behavior, I totally get that as an environment minister. The price on pollution on the industrial side, we certainly put forward plans on that and put legislation in place that is compliant with the federal requirements for carbon. I'm not opposed to a carbon tax philosophically in any way. I think, quite frankly, to alter behavior, I get that, but policy cannot be implemented in a vacuum. It needs to recognize the realities we're in. And Nova Scotians and Canadians, I believe, want practical and realistic alternatives to fossil fuels. So let's begin to develop that in a very assertive manner. Canada doesn't have, at the moment, offshore wind development. That's remarkable. I mean, I've had the opportunity. I've been fortunate to be able to visit the Baltic states, to Denmark, and I've been able to see the offshore wind development there. It's hard to believe that we don't have that, and that's what we were saying.
Not for lack of trying, though, because I don't have to tell you, it has been attempted in this country, and the wind speeds at the ocean level, at the sea level, oftentimes is almost too powerful. So it's not for lack of trying.
Well, look, we have a real opportunity here in Nova Scotia. We have unbelievable potential for the winds, and that's what we've been saying. Rather than put our energy towards a carbon tax, which in a time of global inflation that we haven't seen since the late 1970s, let's take a different path to achieve our climate targets in Nova Scotia and in Canada. And that's what we were proposing to Ottawa. Carbon tax is one tool that can be utilized to adapt and mitigate the realities of climate change. And again, in a time of historic inflation, in a time where Nova Scotians and Canadians, their pocketbooks are hurting pretty bad, it's not needed. Alternatives, especially when alternatives are available.
But what about the rebates? What about the rebates, though? Because Ottawa does make that argument, and in other jurisdictions, this is what happens. People pay for the carbon tax up front. Arguably, it influences their behavior at the cash register, but then they come back with rebates to offset the amount that they're paying more when they actually buy something. And in Nova Scotia's case, the rebates will even be higher for rural Nova Scotians.
So we have a lot of concerns in terms of how the formula, how they developed those rebates, because I know they had mentioned that in the briefing today. So a province like Nova Scotia, 40% of our residents are rural. So they still have to get to work. They still have to get kids to school and to their activities. The upfront costs. We have big concerns of those upfront costs on people's pocketbooks, especially when, in our analysis, it's not going to do anything to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because people still need to drive. They still need to get to work. They still need to go about their lives. And that's why we put forward, I think, practical, realistic alternatives to a carbon tax. And, yes, there are rebates, but we have concerns that those rebates aren't going to be enough to offset those costs. And I want to assure residents in my province that their provincial government is certainly going to be looking at supplementary supports that the provincial government can offer long-term and short-term. But again, a carbon tax in a time of high inflation such as this, we don't believe it's the right policy tool. And and fundamentally, that's where we're at. And I don't believe any policy, being a student of history, should ever be absolute. What we're doing is we're questioning an approach on the part of the federal government, and we feel a carbon tax is not needed at a time like this.
Minister, really appreciate the time. Thank you for it.
Thank you.
The federal government has just announced new sanctions against the regime of Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. They come as the exiled opposition leader of Belarus, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, visits Canada and makes appeals to the Trudeau government. In part, she's looking for non-military aid for Belarusians who are going against their own government and defending Ukraine from Russian invasion. Take a listen to the Foreign Affairs Minister, Mélanie Joly, as she announced today's new sanctions.
Two things we're really looking into. Obviously, the fact that there are gross human rights violations in Belarus, and also because Belarus is complicit in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we want to make sure that we amplify democratic voices within Belarus, including yours. So this morning, you all saw, we announced new sanctions against people and companies that are linked to the war in Ukraine. And our goal is really to make sure that impunity is not an option, and we put maximum pressure on these Belarusian individuals and entities.
We are now joined by Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Good evening.
Now, your trip to Canada is not yet over, but already the Foreign Affairs Minister has announced further sanctions against the Lukashenko regime. Are you happy with what you've heard so far?
I have to say that, first of all, I'm grateful to Canada for its strong commitment to democratic principles and staying with the Belarusian fight. I welcome the sanctions imposed by the Canadian government. It's a clear sign that Lukashenko's crimes will not stay unpunished. But I have been asking for more sanctions on those who are assisting to the regime, to propaganda outlets, TV channels, newspapers, military officials who support this war. And the sanctions that are imposed are rather good, but I have to underline the sanctions work only with the assistance to civil society who need energy to continue their fight. So on our meeting, I asked more assistance to our media to counter propaganda, to our human rights defending centers, to different cultural and national initiatives. So this two-sided approach will be more efficient.
So more aid for your media, more aid for your human rights organizations. You're also, to my understanding, looking for non-lethal military aid from Canada, and that goes to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, which the Lukashenko regime has been helping. What kind of aid would you like to see?
That several hundreds of Belarusian military volunteers are fighting shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainians. So we ask Canada to support Belarusian volunteers within Ukrainian army with non-lethal equipment, warm clothing, first aid kits. And I understand that they're serving in Ukrainian army, but if such humanitarian aid will be sent directly to Belarusian regiment, it will be very important symbolic sign for them that they are noticed, that they are not forgotten, that Canada knows about their bravery within Ukrainian army.
So direct aid for Belarusian fighters. Now, you're also hoping for closer diplomatic ties with Canada. You're not in Belarus right now, but you have established a government in exile. What kind of ties are you hoping to achieve?
So first of all, we need a constant person who will coordinate our actions and the actions of Canadian government. So I asked Minister Jolie to give mandate to Ambassador to Lithuania to give mandate to work with democratic forces of Belarus. It will be good. I'm sure it will be good collaboration. Also, I ask Canada to be our voice in G7 or G20, for example, to keep Belarus in focus of the most powerful countries.
Now, you still have meetings this week scheduled with the Prime Minister, also members of the Canadian Senate. Overall, though, what message do you hope those politicians here, the leaders here, and really listen to while you're in Canada?
So first of all, I want people in Canada and parliamentarians and government to distinguish Belarusian regime from Belarusian people. Belarusian regime became accomplice in this war against Ukraine, and Belarusian people are fiercely opposing this. 86% of Belarusians are against participation of Belarus in this war. Also distinguish Belarus and Russia. We have absolutely different context, and moods inside society is absolutely different. Also, I underline that Belarus participation of the Belarusian regime shouldn't be overlooked in this situation, because very often the world is talking about the war crimes of Kremlin, but don't mention Lukashenko's participation. But he has to share or to bear the full responsibility for his crimes against humanity, against Belarusians, and for his war crimes. So also I ask Canadians to demand withdrawal of Russian troops, not only from Ukraine, but also from Belarus, because at the moment about 12,000 Russian soldiers are situated in our army, and it's de facto military occupation.
Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, thank you so much for the time. Very much happy to be speaking with you tonight.
Thank you.
And that is our program for tonight. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.